Buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because you're about to learn a whole lot about Tweedle Dum and Tweedle Dee. And honestly, I did not realize there was so much history behind these two. See, I always thought the Tweedles were completely original characters, but no. Alice in Wonderland's fame has just eclipsed the source material they came from, a nursery rhyme. I know that some of you are rolling your eyes at my ignorance, either because you know the rhyme or because there's a line in the book that literally says, "The words of the old song kept ringing through her head," with the lyrics right below it. But I don't know, maybe when I read this story the first time, I still thought the rhyme originated within the Alice canon. Regardless, the rhyme goes as follows. Tweedle Dum and Tweedle Dee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedle Dum said Tweedle Dee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking, what? But don't worry, I got the inside scoop. If you've seen my Nursery Rhymes Explained series, you'll know the majority of messed up origin stories for nursery rhymes are really just decades-old myths that either don't have any compelling evidence to back them up, or in some cases are verifiably false. What's cool about Tweedle Dum and Tweedle Dee, though, is we know exactly when the terms were invented, who invented them, and who they were meant to make fun of. Let's go back to the year 1720, a time when Johann Sebastian Bach was actively composing some of the most famous melodies the world will ever know, and wealthy Victorians are hosting mummy unwrapping parties with the intention of eating the mummies to prolong their own lives. Also taking place at this time was a little artistic rivalry between two composers whose names I'll forget the moment I finish recording this episode, George Frederick Handel and Giovanni Bononcini. See? You're gonna forget them too. To put it simply, both Handel and Bononcini were hired to compose operas for the Royal Academy of Music Company, which King George I and a bunch of Richie Riches founded, so they had an endless supply of operas to watch. This is not to be confused with the Royal Academy of Music in London, which opened 100 years later and is still enriching students' lives with music to this day. But it has a scary elevator, and for that reason, Cole Wilson had to give it 1 star. What a shithole. Anyway, both of the aforementioned composers, Handel and Bononcini, were talented lads, and soon enough the Richie Riches started to argue among themselves about which composer they liked more. And I guess the feud became a pretty big deal, because in 1725, the English poet John Byrom wrote a rhyme satirizing the whole situation. Some say, compared to Bononcini, that Mynheer Handel's but a ninny. Others aver that he to Handel's scarcely fit to hold a candle. Strange all this difference should be twixt Tweedle Dum and Tweedle Dee. What the fuck? So that is the earliest known appearance of the Tweedle Dum and Tweedle Dee names in any printed media, and ipso facto, the potential real-life identities of the Tweedles. But it's obviously not the nursery rhyme that Alice was talking about. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes, one of the most trusted resources on said topic, that rhyme was not put into print until 80 years after Byrom, when the original Juvenile Library put out a collection called Original Ditties for the Nursery in 1806. We still don't have an author. The J. Harris listed on the cover is the book's publisher, but all of the rhymes included would have been in the public domain anyway. They also don't have any melodies, so there's no composer to give credit to. Now, just to be clear, it is totally possible that the children's rhyme about the battle and the rattle existed before John Byrom wrote his epigram about the composers, and that could be where he took the terms Tweedle Dee and Tweedle Dum from. But because the children's rhyme wasn't published until almost a century after his epigram, he was the first one to use them in a written work, and so he's officially credited as the creator of the terms. But while Lewis Carroll may have taken their name from the pre-existing rhyme, the peculiar way that illustrator John Tenniel depicts the Tweedles wearing schoolboy skeleton suits is completely original and unique to this story. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first time the duo was ever illustrated, but I may have missed some obscure nursery rhyme collection with little illustrations like this one here has. And now I want to tell you about our sponsor, Squarespace, who've made web design so easy, they basically build your website for you. Thanks to their new AI tools like Design Intelligence, your business, side hustle, passion project, or dog can have a dedicated website in minutes. You just gotta tell it what kind of site you need, your aesthetic preferences, and your job is done. Of course, if you want to fine-tune things, that option is always there, and the drag and drop capabilities of the Fluid engine make it incredibly easy. Whether you're trying to sell some homemade goods, share your art with the world in a custom portfolio, manage reservations for your restaurant, or just give your community a home base like I try to do with MessedUpOrigins.com, you can do it with Squarespace. To try them out yourself, go to squarespace.com/Jon Solo or hit the link in the description to start a free trial. Then, when you realize you love it, use code Jon Solo at checkout to get 10% off. Alice's encounter with the Tweedles in the book is actually reimagined pretty well in the movie, the animated one. The 2010 remake clearly had no idea what to do with them, and the extent of their role is summed up in this one scene that I am convinced writer Linda Wolverton included as a metaphor for her own struggles trying to utilize them in the plot.
Speak, boys. Amuse us. I love my fat boys. Now, get out.
She did find some clever ways to reference them in the sequel, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, since the animated Alice focuses on the story from the first book, she runs into the Tweedles while chasing after the White Rabbit. But in Through the Looking Glass, she's still on her way to the other side of the chessboard where she'll hopefully be turned from a pawn to a queen. Both versions of Alice notice how odd the little fat boys are right away, as well as the fact that they have their names stitched on their collars. Both Alices also mistake the Tweedles as statues because they're standing so still, a faux pas that they chastise her for before demonstrating how to properly greet someone. Then, when she reaches out to shake both their hands at the same time, out of fear of offending them by picking one over the other, the boys just start spinning around in circles while Alice sings "Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush." Once again, this is all reflected in the animated movie. But speaking of reflections, I noticed something really interesting about the Tweedles while reading the primary resource I used for this episode, the Annotated Alice. One of the annotations points out that Dum and Dee are not just identical, they mirror each other and are known as enantiomorphs. If you look at this illustration of them, you'll see that one has his right hand extended while the other has his left. And the same thing happens in the 1951 Alice, showing just how detail-oriented their artists used to be. After Dee and Dum finish their etiquette lesson, they start an absurdly long poem about a walrus and a carpenter. And normally I wouldn't want to get sidetracked, but screw it, we have time. It's actually a pretty funny story. And a little bit sad. Basically, a walrus and a carpenter are walking on the beach on a bright, sunshiny day, wishing that somebody would clean up all the sand. Then they convince a family of oysters, child oysters mind you, to walk on the beach with them, which is curious considering oysters don't have feet. After that, they eat the oysters, betraying the trust their new friends had placed in them and only feeling a little guilty about it when all was said and done. The poem is pointless and the ending is pretty messed up. But if you're crying big cartoony tears over the young oyster's fate, you'll be happy to know that in the stage play, they get revenge. The ghosts of the oysters come back and attack the walrus and carpenter in their sleep by stomping on their chests. Which again doesn't make any sense because they shouldn't have feet, but I suppose I can suspend my disbelief. Now, unlike the poem about the Tweedles, The Walrus and the Carpenter is a Lewis Carroll original, and while tempting, it's probably not worth it to comb through for any symbolism or hidden meaning. I say this because the Annotated Alice includes a letter from Carroll himself where he mentions telling illustrator John Tenniel that he could pick any partner for the walrus that he wanted as long as it had 3 syllables, like the word carpenter, and made for an interesting drawing. Some alternates he suggested were baronet and butterfly, but Tenniel went with carpenter in the end. Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, was an eccentric weirdo whose personal life and niche interests always made their way into his written works. but as you can see, he didn't let them get in the way of telling an entertaining story that audiences would love. When his illustrator expressed concern over how he could draw a carpenter in an entertaining way, Carroll listened and said that he could replace it as long as it didn't mess with the poem structure. Where another author might have said no, because their dad was a carpenter and he loved to eat oysters and was raised by walruses, allowing their personal attachment to sabotage their work. Of course, if you're confident in your vision, then you gotta stick to it and defend it where necessary, but make sure it really is the vision that you're defending and not your ego. Anyway, once the poem ends, we get a scene that's exclusive to the book. Dee and Dum take Alice to the Red King, who's sleeping nearby, probably referencing that kings in chess barely move, and they debate what he could be dreaming about. Dee and Dum are adamant that he's dreaming about Alice, but this opens up a whole can of worms and a wormhole, because Alice is dreaming about the king while the king dreams about Alice, who's dreaming about the king while the king dreams about Alice, who's dreaming about the king while he's dreaming about Alice, who dreams about him while he's dreaming about her, who's dreaming about him while he's dreaming about her. When Alice tries to walk away, Tweedle Dum grabs her by the wrist and points at the ground with a fear-stricken face. The new white rattle he just bought yesterday is broken, and Tweedle Dee is to blame. So they recruit Alice to help them suit up for a duel, just like in the nursery rhyme. Now, if you're watching this episode on YouTube or Spotify, then you can see the rattle in the illustration, and it's a little known fact that Carroll did not like this illustration. Do you want to know why? Pause the video to leave your guess in a comment, but the real answer is ... It's the wrong kind of rattle. John Tenniel drew what's called a watchman's rattle instead of a children's rattle. Nowadays, watchman's rattles are mostly used as noisemakers at parties, but apparently they were notoriously easy to break, which is why Tenniel went with this version for the broken rattle. I don't know why Carroll didn't just request Tenniel change the rattle before it was published, but my guess is that it escaped his vision on the first pass and then he didn't notice it until it was too late. Well, Dee and Dum have gotta settle the score over this broken rattle situation, and after Alice armors up the Tweedles with pots, pans, cushions, and blankets, they're ready to fight. But they're immediately interrupted by a monstrous crow that scares them away. Again, just like the nursery rhyme. Interestingly, the book describes the crow as casting a giant shadow over the forest, and there's a theory that this is a reference to the Eclipse of Tales. After the Lydians and the Medes had been engaged in a grueling war for 5 years, one of their battles was interrupted by an eclipse, and the day suddenly turning to night convinced the leaders to end the conflict and negotiate peace. Personally, I think this similarity in themes is just a coincidence, but I'll take any excuse to talk mythology. Now, I will say that as pointless as the Tweedles were in the live-action movies, they did manage to reference the original rhyme in each one. In Burton's movie, they're picked up by a giant bird, but I think it's a jub-jub bird, which means this is also a reference to the Jabberwocky poem. And in Through the Looking Glass, we see the young Dee and Dum duel each other in the snow. They even break their weapons and start crying, which has gotta be a reference to the broken rattle situation. In the book, though, Alice is just as scared of the bird as they are, so she runs deeper into the wood to escape it. She eventually finds a safe haven, but she can still feel the terrific wind from its flapping wings, and then she notices off in the distance, someone's shawl is blowing away. And if you want to know who it belongs to, make sure to tune in next Thursday when I post my full-length deep dive into the messed up origins of Alice Through the Looking Glass. Or read the book. It's in the public domain. You can just Google it. Either way, I'll see you next Thursday.